The first Duckett to come to Duckett's Grove in 1695 was Thomas Duckett. He came from Westmoreland in England, and he bought 500 acres from Thomas Crosswaite, who lived in a town called Cockermount in the Lake District in England. The 500 acres was the beginning of what would develop into a very large estate of actually 12,000 acres. They had assembled that land by the middle 1800s. As part of the development of the Duckett estate, the first house was built there in the early 1700s. It was said not to be a very large house, rectangular in shape, 2 stories over basement. Of course, it would have been developed hugely in the 1830s. Now, the reason for that was the Ducketts always tended to marry well, as we say in the countryside, and it was William Duckett married Elizabeth Dawson Coates in the early 1800s, and she was the sole heiress to the Dawson Coates estate in Dublin. Her father was a banker and a developer. In fact, Dawson Street is named after him, and the mansion house was actually their city home, which was subsequently bought by Dublin Corporation as a home for the Lord Mayor. Now, that gave you some idea of the wealth that came in, because the house as we see it today, you can see the modern sections, the newer type of granite stone, and that's to be seen on the western aspect of the house. There was also a similar development on the opposite side. All of the windows were enlarged and developed to a different style than the rather plain or early house. Another development at that time, of course, was the Towers Gate Lodge, as it became known. It was part of that development in the 1830s. The architect there was Thomas Cobden, and of course Cobden would have been known as the architect for the cathedral in Carlow. Along with the development of the house, of course, very extensive buildings were added. It is said there was somewhere near to 70 people working around the domain lands. Now, it's interesting to explain the domain lands around Duckett's Grove was about 1,300 acres, and the remainder of the 12,000 acres was actually at various locations, some in Wicklow, some in Kildare, some in Laois. So they actually had land spread across 4 counties. This land, of course, would have been managed by land agents. The family had little or no contact even with their workers, because the layout of houses, and that meant that unless the essential staff like butlers and people like that were the only people who interacted with the family. Another feature of Duckett's Grove, and of course all big houses, were the wall gardens. I think the wall gardens at Duckett's Grove cover close maybe to 4 acres, where you had extensive vegetable growing and fruit growing. Again, if you can sort of visualize going back 100 or 150 years ago, you didn't have the same level of supplies in shops, and neither was it easy to get to shops as it is now. So a place like Duckett's Grove would have been largely self-sufficient, both in meat and vegetables and fruit. And that, of course, entailed a very large staff. I mean, you could have had up to 10 people working in gardens. That would include, of course, the lawns and pleasure gardens, as well as the wall vegetable gardens. while the Ducketts were extensive landowners, unlike some other of the bigger landed families in Carlow, they didn't engage in politics. If you take an example like the Bruins of Oak Park or the Browns of Browns Hill, Kavanaghs of Borris, they were heavily involved in politics, and more often than not, there would have been a member of those families sitting in Parliament. I think I can only identify one Duckett who stood in a local type election, but none of them ever sought membership of Parliament. They busied themselves, it seems, with just running their estate, and of course they travelled extensively. To travel to India, obviously London was a regular spot, France, so again, like most of these families, they generally tended to spend maybe about 6 months at their own base house, and the rest of the year they would have travelled. I suppose the Duckett story, you had a situation where there were an enormously wealthy family, and towards the end you had William Duckett. Now, William Duckett's first wife died in 1895, and he subsequently married for a second time. Now, they had in the first marriage there was no children, and his second wife was a widow with one surviving daughter from her first marriage. And William then died in 1908. Now, he left his wife an estate valued at 200,000. Now, that was an incredible amount of money, difficult to equate it into the kind of millions that would be in today's money. She remained living at Duckett's Grove until 1916. The fact that she left in 1916 had nothing to do with the politics of the situation in Ireland at the time. It was more related to the marriage of her daughter. She doesn't seem to have agreed with Olive's romance with a fellow called Stamer O'Grady. He was from County Clare. And they moved to live in London, and Mrs. Duckett left Duckett's Grove. So you could say the end of the Duckett connection with Duckett's Grove was in 1916. When Mrs. Duckett died in 1933, her estate at that stage was worth about 100,000. She excluded her daughter totally out of the will. She gave her what was known as the angry shilling, and by including her to that extent, it was meant that she couldn't sue and challenge the will, but she did. The relationship between mother and daughter was really tragic story, really, because she was an only daughter, and they had lived together at Duckett's Grove from the time she married William. But it was a very uneasy kind of situation, because Olive liked a good social life. Mrs. Duckett was a very puritanical type of person. She read the Bible extensively. She tried to apply the Bible to her daily life down to great detail. So, I think the marriage, though, was the breaking point. And in fact, between 1916 and the early 30s, the two never met or spoke. So, I mean, talk about tragedy within the walls of great wealth and opulence. Here was the classic example. But the will was challenged in 1939, and the challenge ended up that Mrs. Duckett's will was overturned, and 1/3 or 30-odd thousand was given to Olive. The remainder, part of the remainder went to legal fees, and the real balance, if you like, went to the charities that Mrs. Duckett had nominated. In the first instance, when she excluded Olive, she had actually given all her money to charity. Now, I said earlier on that when William died, he left her 200,000. There was 100,000 less there when Mrs. Duckett died, a relatively short time, well, 30 odd years later. She had bequeathed most of that money to charity in her own lifetime. I mean, she paid for a wing to the then Adelaide Hospital in Dublin. She funded churches for lumberjacks in Canada. She helped out in various countries in Africa, leper colonies and that kind of stuff. So she was an enormously generous woman. And to the extent, as I said, that she gave away half her fortune in a relatively short space of time. Well, when Mrs. Duckett left, the house was there, was fully furnished, and was looked after by the land agent. When the trouble started, the IRA occupied Duckett's Grove, and they were there, and it was a training camp in the period prior to the truce. What's interesting was that the IRA were there, but the auction of the contents didn't take place for several months after they left. It had been fully furnished in the 7 or 8 years from 1916. But the house was left intact by the IRA. It wasn't looted, there was no damage other than to the statues. The statues were used for target practice, so I suppose that would be kind of a reasonable expectation at the time. Well, Linda Cairns was pretty much the biggest name at Duckett's Grove. Now, she had escaped from, I think it was Cork prison, along with two other Cumann members. And yeah, she was certainly at Duckett's Grove. Other than that, I think it was pretty much a local group of volunteers, Carlow Town and various places, that would have used it as a training camp. The clearance sale in December 1923 took 3 days and yielded somewhere short of £10,000. Again, an enormous amount of money, would probably have purchased 1,000 acres of land in that era or more. So it was an incredible amount of money. It was regarded as probably one of the best furnished houses of any house in County Carlow. The extent of the furnishings and the value was absolutely stunning. Now, in terms of the estate itself, the 12,000, or most of the 12,000 acres, with the exception of the domain lands, would have been divided under the various land acts from 1880 onwards, and there were several land acts. But what was interesting about the domain lands were purchased by a group of local farmers. Now, they purchased the estate for something like 28,000, but they never could agree on how they might divide it. You know, they had this 1,300 acres. There could have been 30 or 40 different between workers and small landholders in the area. And in the end, the Bank of Ireland, decided that they would call in their loan, and the Land Commission was brought in then. The Land Commission cleared the debt that had been created by the local landowners, and the Land Commission divided the land among about 40 different smaller holders and labourers from the estate. And so it was a very extensive division done on the 1,300 acres. So that's how Duckett's Grove kind of ended in terms of a big estate. Carlow, I think I described Carlow as one of the most gentrified counties in Ireland. In other words, the number of families, there was at least 30 land-owning families in County Carlow. And the amount of land that they had would have varied maybe from as little as 2,000 acres up to 20,000 acres. And in that latter bracket, you would have had Bruins and Kavanaghs. And then you had various landowners with maybe 5,000 acres. So the big families in this area, you had the Ducketts, you had the Burtons, the Bruins, the Browns of Browns Hill. They were the big landowners in this immediate area. Out at Ballintemple, then, of course, you had the Butlers. Now, they were a very extensive landowning family as well. They virtually controlled probably as much as 80% of the entire county in terms of ownership. And I suppose the whole political story there is a very long story. And maybe not for now trying to unpick all the the struggles and rows and battles that went on. But the Ducketts appear to have been, if you like, an accepted land class. There's no huge evidence of large-scale evictions. Workers seem to have been well treated. And it's interesting, actually, that Duckett's Grove, the IRA occupied the house, but there must have been some residual good feeling that, say, it wasn't damaged, it wasn't looted. So the evidence, just supposing that as evidence, I think it's the view that they were accepted as fairly decent people is true. There might have been other landlords like the Beresfords that mightn't have had quite the same image. Duckett's Grove, as I said, the auction took place of the contents in 1923. The Land Commission would have been in possession of the estate for several years. I think it was 1933 when the eventual completion of the division took place. The house and 11 acres, and the house was intact in 1933 when it was purchased by a local business. Yeah, the house was completely destroyed in 1933. Now, there's a few things about the burning of Duckett's Grove. For example, there was a steward around the place, and he spotted the fire in the evening. He went to bed, and when he got up the next morning, the fire, he thought he had quenched what was a smallish outbreak of a fire. When he got up the next morning, the fire had reactivated. Now, it's almost beyond belief that at that time, no phones. So he had to get on a bike, cycle to Carlow. When he got to Carlow, the fire tender was either, I don't know, there was something wrong anyway, and they had to borrow a truck from Thompson's or Corcoran's in Carlow and drive to Duckett's Grove. There, they discovered, of course, there was no supply of water of any consequence. If you visualize Duckett's Grove, there's no big streams flowing anywhere or rivers flowing close. So, the sequence of events that converged that day and that it couldn't be saved were absolutely unbelievable. The council bought Duckett's Grove near enough 10 years ago now, and there was quite a bit of money spent on securing the building. I think any of us driving the road would before the council bought it, just saw it as a ruin, but and a ruin that had pretty much stayed the same for a long number of years. But in reality, the building apparently was close to collapse. And the council got in and did a stabilization project. And of course, the other work now has been done in the gardens. The gardens have been impressively restored and are becoming an increasingly important tourist attraction. And I think going forward, there will be a fund there to do certain works. I don't think people ought to expect a roof on the place in the not too distant future. But yeah, it's an important building in Carlow. It's an iconic kind of ruin, and people enjoy it as a ruin. And the visitor figures are certainly impressive now. The Duckett's Grove was one of some 60 houses that I featured in the Carlow Gentry, a book published in 1993, and happily had a reasonably good level of sales. It was a subject that somehow touched the population of Carlow. And as I said, we featured, there were 60 houses, but there was actually 30 families. In most cases, every family had two houses. They had the main family seat, and then you had a dower house. So the dower house, by the way, for Duckett's Grove was Russellstown Park, and that was demolished by the Land Commission in the mid-1950s or late 50s. And Russellstown Park then, of course, was close by to Burton Hall, and that house too was demolished. So a lot of houses were demolished that time because there was simply nobody wanted to buy them. They were astronomically big houses, requiring a lot of maintenance and upkeep generally. So when the Land Commission bought an estate, unless there was some good reason or a buyer in the wings to buy the house, they would generally demolish them. And a lot of houses were demolished. It's interesting in Carlow, in fact, now that not a lot. There's about, I think, a dozen or so houses that either were burned. There was 3 houses burned during the Troubles, and the others were simply burned accidentally or whatever over the years. But quite a lot of houses in Carlow are still standing and still lived in, and